Hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Inside Investing, the show that helps you level up your financial knowledge and sharpen your investing skills. I'm your host here in Amin. The Registered Retirement Savings Plan, or RRSP, is often heralded by investors as an effective tool to help build a retirement nest egg. It allows the investments held inside to benefit from tax-deferred growth until retirement. Simply put, that can be a lot of time for compound interest to work its magic. Unfortunately, most Canadians don't take full advantage of the savings potential of an RRSP. Just 23% of tax filers contributed to an RRSP in the 2021 fiscal year, and average contributions were well short of the annual limit, according to data from Statistics Canada. Of course, it's understandable with the cost of living on the rise that some Canadians may have less money to invest, but it would be a shame if they let the opportunity that RRSPs offer to pass by them. So we're going to discuss some ways to help bolster the amount of RRSP contributions an investor can afford to make. Here to share his wisdom is a maven of Canadian tax strategy. Joining us is Talbot Stevens, founder of Financial Success Strategies. He's also the author of the books The Smart Debt Coach and Financial Freedom Without Sacrifice. Talbot, thanks for swinging by. Great to have you with us here today.
It's great to be here and share some ideas.
Absolutely. So before we get into our topic, I just wanted to ask you a couple of questions off the bat just to get to know you a little bit better. Can you tell us a little bit about the work that you do to help support investors and financial planners?
Well, the short story is that I graduated after 19 years of formal education, 2 degrees, engineering, computer science, and discovered, unfortunately, that I was financially illiterate and decided that I should do something about that. So I researched and eventually wrote my first book. And in the process, it was well received by the financial industry. So I've done a lot of work with financial advisors through client seminars and workshops on a general topic of how to increase wealth and retirement savings. And then very quickly, I wanted to increase my understanding of an advanced topic related to borrowing to invest. I know that's very controversial and people have to be very careful of the risks associated there, but I've dug deep into that topic and been a bit of a leader in helping both the advisory industry and investors understand what strategies might be worth considering if implemented responsibly.
All right. And our topic today is focused around RRSP. So why do you feel the RRSP is such a misunderstood and underutilized investing account?
Well, the bottom line is because we're not taught about personal finance in general, there are gaps in our knowledge that can truly make a huge difference in our financial outcomes. And in this case of RRSPs, one of the core concepts that we don't understand is the difference between before tax and after tax dollars. Any business owner and certainly the wealthy are very aware of this difference, right? And to keep things simple, I'll often reference the 50% tax bracket. And the bottom line is, if someone is in a 50% tax bracket, you literally have to earn $2 on a before tax basis to end up with $1 after tax to either spend or invest.
Yep. And we're going to certainly unpack more of that as we converse here. So, but before we get into that, I have a trivia question for our audience. How large was the median RRSP contribution in fiscal 2021? It's the latest year for which data is available. We'll reveal the answer at the end of our conversation, so stay tuned. Okay, before we dive into our topic, just a quick note to our audience. We'll discuss some ways to help boost the investing potential of an RRSP that investors can consider. However, everyone's financial circumstances are unique, so they may not make sense for all investors. Take them as food for thought in your financial planning rather than explicit financial advice. Consider speaking with a tax specialist or financial planner if you have questions about your specific circumstances. Also, we'll use some simplified examples to help explain each strategy along the way. They won't reflect potential trading commissions, fees, and other more nuanced costs. So treat them as illustrations of the broader strategy rather than exact calculations. With all that said, let's get into it. The first question I got for you here. There are a lot of misconceptions about RRSP as we alluded to just a moment ago. So can you clarify how the account works in broad strokes for us?
Well, in simple terms, the key parameters that investors need to understand is that when you put money into a registered retirement savings plan, you do reduce your taxes. You do get a tax deduction and therefore generally a tax refund. And so you're putting money into an account that produces a tax benefit up front. But people need to and sometimes overlook the reality that when you take that money out of the plan, it is 100% taxable, every penny, not just the growth, but also the money you put in. Yes, there are limits to how much you can put in. The government doesn't give you unlimited access to defer taxes. And really, that's the right way to think of a registered retirement savings plan or an RSP as a government approved tax deferral plan. All of the money that you put in, the tax on that is deferred, but when you take it out, it is of course taxable. So you can put in up to 18% of your previous year's earned income up to a limit that is currently a little less than $31,000. But those are the fundamental concepts that people need to understand when using an RSP.
And I like that you mentioned and emphasized the word tax deferred because a lot of us are also familiar with the TFSA account, and that's one where it's tax free, where there's no taxes being charged there. But in this one, there will be taxes, but it just happens much later,
That's right.
usually around retirement, I assume.
Absolutely. And that is a critical point to be clear on for investors. It is a deferral plan only. If they use this type of retirement savings incorrectly, they would actually be better off not using RSPs at all. Even a taxable account can be better. And again, if we drill down into the specifics, this becomes more relevant as we get closer to retirement. You need to give the RSP time, in this case, as much as decades as possible, to really work its magic.
You like to explain the tax implications of RRSP contributions by comparing them to pasta. So help us out here. What does pasta have to do with investing?
Well, I will admit it's a bit of an off the wall metaphor, if you will, and hopefully it can help some people understand this core issue of after tax, before tax dollars. And while I'm not the best cook or chef in the world, I do know that when we cook pasta, we start off with smaller dry pasta, which I might liken to after tax dollars. And when you, of course, cook it, it absorbs water and gets larger. And that's what we need to do when we put money in the RSP, and that is to move it closer to larger before tax dollars. An unrealistic but a simple 50% tax bracket, again, to keep the math even as simple as possible, we'll consider $1,000. So an investor has $1,000 to invest. They're in a 50% tax bracket. If they put that money into an RSP, the first thing we need to recognize is that we've converted what we started with after tax money into before tax money. And here's where the first, unfortunately, most popular RRSP refund strategy comes in. I would suggest that 80, 90% even of Canadians do what with that refund, Huron?
We spend it.
We spend it. In fact, I would even
Yeah.
argue that some investors mentally spend that refund
Yeah.
before they put the money in the RSP. But what we need to fully appreciate is that if we start with $1,000 of fuel that we want to go towards our retirement savings, and we put that into an RSP and behaviorally spend the refund, we've really only put $500 of after-tax fuel towards our intended goal. If you spend the refund like most Canadians do, you are truly, generally without knowing it, investing less towards your retirement than you start with and probably intended.
Okay. All right, that sums it up beautifully there, Talbot. Now, it sounds like understanding which tax bracket investor falls into is a key consideration when using an RSP. So, what are some potential tax-related pitfalls they could fall into if they're unaware?
A lot of people naturally want to use RSPs thinking I'm going to put it into the tax deferral plan when I'm in a high-ish tax bracket and perhaps sometimes even assume that later during retirement, they're going to take that money out at a lower tax bracket. And obviously, if you can do that, there's going to be a benefit. But when you're contributing, you might be misled into thinking that you're going to get a larger tax refund than you think. And that might happen when your contribution pushes you into a slightly lower tax bracket. And we can give an example of that if you wish. Let's say there's a tax bracket boundary at $50,000 of income. If you earned $55,000 of income and just for discussion's sake, put $10,000 into an RSP, the RSP contribution effectively is like a deduction, so that reduces the taxable income from $55,000 down to $45,000. But again, assuming there's a tax bracket change at $50,000, you're not going to have the same refund on every dollar that's contributed to the RSP. You're going to drop, for instance, say from a 30% tax bracket down to a 20% tax bracket, and therefore the total refund will be reduced.
Given all of this, would you say there's a certain income level at which contributing to an RRSP generally makes most sense?
Everyone's individual situation is unique, and therefore, of course, they are well advised to check their situation with a financial professional. But generally, the wealthy, the top income bracket, they already take advantage of RSPs. We know that. It's really the middle income Canadian who probably benefits the most from this type of a savings plan. And while the lower income group could and sometimes should use an RSP to save, oftentimes they are better off not doing that for a couple of reasons. One, they won't get obviously the same tax benefit in terms of a tax refund that could perhaps be reinvested. But the other thing they need to be careful of is if a low income individual before retirement retires also as a low income situation, they might face the clawback of government retirement benefits, both in the form of OAS and the guaranteed income supplement. People need to recognize that the clawback of the guaranteed income supplement is at a 50% rate.
Wow.
So the government is giving low income seniors a tax-free payout of guaranteed income supplement. And for every dollar of income they earn, whether it's a part-time job or a withdrawal from an RSP or RIF, that reduces their guaranteed income supplement by 50 cents on every dollar. So if they also are facing, say, a 20% tax bracket, they're effectively losing 70 cents on every dollar that they might withdraw from the RSP. So we can see in this situation, if they, for instance, start in a 20% tax bracket before retirement, put money into an RSP, and then have it come out at effectively a 70% tax bracket, clearly there's a situation where they'd be better off not using an RSP. That's where a TFSA is the clear winner.
Okay. Now, it's interesting you mentioned that because, so just so I understand, even though this money you put into an RSP is tax deferred, it still gets treated as income when you take it out. So it's almost like you're earning, like if you withdraw 5 or 10,000 at a certain point and, after you're 70, for example, that's $10,000 of income I just made is what it gets calculated as.
Absolutely. And that's where we have to be careful, particularly with what I've called a clawback, but really we need to recognize that a clawback of a government benefit is essentially what some people I call a hidden tax, right?
Yeah.
People aren't aware of how that truly impacts the net amount that they get to end up at keep to either spend or invest.
All right, now that we have a better understanding of some of the tax implications of an RRSP, let's dig into some of the ways to help investors maximize their savings potential. The first one we alluded to earlier in our conversation, and that's to reinvest the tax refund from RRSP contributions. What's the benefit in doing this?
We want to put that refund, all of it, back into the RRSP. Now, even if we do that here, and we have to be careful that we don't put what we might call partially cooked pasta in our RSP. And what that means is, let's work through this example. You start with 1,000, you get a $500 refund back, 50% of the 1,000 obviously, right? So now our total contribution, if we did this, would be $1,500. But in a 50% tax bracket, how much is that truly worth on an after-tax basis? If we cash that money out the next year, how much would we end up with? And clearly the reason I use a 50% tax bracket is we'd lose half of it. Half of $1,500 is $750. But note that we started with $1,000 of after-tax money or fuel to put towards a retirement. We still haven't gotten back to where we started. So yes, the second refund strategy of reinvesting all of the refund is good. And in this case, increases the retirement savings by 50%, the rate of the tax bracket, obviously.
You know, it's one lesson that I was taught from a family member who used to do my taxes when I was a young kid, and he always said, "You get your refund, put it into your RSP, as soon as you get it, so you're not having to worry about spending it." So, how could an investor figure out how much they might boost their RSP savings by reinvesting their refund?
Well, that fortunately is very easy. It's basically the amount of your tax rate. So again, we mentioned earlier that you might need to be careful that you might drop into a slightly lower tax bracket if you cross a tax bracket boundary. But if, for instance, all of your contribution is in a 30% tax bracket, then you're going to benefit by 30% straight up. Okay. So if you put a 50% tax refund back into the RSP, clearly you're going to have 50% more dollars growing towards your retirement, and therefore that portion of your retirement savings will increase by the same 50% ratio.
Let's talk about the RSP and TFSA for a second. So let's say an investor wanted to invest in both of those account types. In your opinion, would it make sense to reinvest the tax refund in a TFSA instead?
If people are looking for simple rules of thumb, then yes, I would suggest that those in the lower tax bracket pause on the RSP until you've done a really careful analysis to make sure it's truly better for you, and use the TFSA. For those in the middle tax bracket, yes, RSPs generally will be better than a TFSA, especially if they perhaps can drop their tax rate as they withdraw the money in retirement. But again, that is only true if they are aware of and properly act on the concepts that we're going to discuss here today. Because as we discussed, even if you reinvest every penny of the 50% refund in our simple example, we still haven't put all of the money we started with into that savings plan. There's also an annual Canadian dilemma of what should you do with that refund if you get it? Should you put it back in the RSP or perhaps pay down debt? And I know that oftentimes there is a consensus, or what I would call a political answer to that question, and that is to do both, right? Put the money first in the RSP and then use that refund and pay down your most expensive debt. Well, that is a good strategy. It also diversifies by strategy, which itself is good. But in my opinion, from a purely rational perspective, if the RSP is the best strategy initially, then what changes a few weeks later when you get the refund? Would we not want that refund to go back into the best strategy until we have no more RSP room and that's not available to us? So that's my answer on that. And yes, sometimes it's not easy to make that correct assessment. But if the pay down debt is the best thing to do with the money initially, well, that's what should happen. It doesn't change a few weeks later when we get a refund. So,
All right, let's move along to our second way to boost RRSP savings, and that's by grossing up their contributions. How does this work?
yeah, and again, we'll go back to our simplistic example of $1,000 to invest, and that's generally after-tax money again, 50% tax bracket. We talked about how reinvesting the $500 refund truly only ends up with $1,500 in the RSP. $1,500, of course, is a before tax amount. That equates to $750 after tax. The only way to get all of the initial after tax money, $1,000, into the RSP is to use a gross up strategy. And the simplest way to explain that and understand that is to use what we might call a gross up loan. So an investor has $1,000 in their pocket, late RSP season, they go out and borrow another $1,000. They put that $2,000 combined into the RSP, right? They'll get a refund back of half of the $2,000, $1,000, right? And if they do that quickly, now these days you can get your taxes filed and refund back in a couple of weeks. They'll get that refund back, and it's enough to completely and almost immediately repay the $1,000 gross up loan, right? So now we truly have the $2,000 in our RSP which equates to $1,000 after tax that we started with. Only by doing this do we get all of our initial and intended retirement savings into that savings plan. So to use our pasta metaphor, the dry past of $1,000 after tax equates to $2,000 of fully cooked pasta before tax dollars in an RSP. That's the math, that's the relationship, again, for a simplistic 50% tax bracket. But we need to do that, or we need to also recognize that we're not investing all of the dollars that we start with and intend to grow towards a retirement.
Now, this saving strategy isn't quite as straightforward as our first one. So can you walk us through the math with an example?
For those math nerds out there, that the right way to convert after-tax dollars into the equivalent before-tax dollars is actually take that after-tax amount, let's say we've got $1,000, and divide it by 1 minus the tax rate. So if you're in a middle tax bracket of $1,000 to contribute on an after-tax basis, you're going to equate that to the $1,000 divided by 1 minus 0.4 in this case, right? So $1,000 divided by 0.6 is $1,667. In other words, it's 2/3 more than you started with, and that is the equivalent grossed up ratio, if you will.
Now, it sounds like RSP gross ups could potentially lead to a massive improvement in retirement savings. So, sticking with our example, how much of a difference in savings might grossing up RRSP contributions make in the long run compared to reinvesting the tax refund and versus not reinvesting at all?
Well, let's start by comparing it to the most common behavioral approach with RSPs, where the refund is spent. So if we start with $1,000 and we gross that up to 2,000 RSP, that's effectively a 100% increase. We have doubled the amount of money in the RSP, which of course is going to double the amount of retirement savings that compounds tax-free decades later. So that in that example, in a 50% tax bracket, we've got a 100% increase. A more realistic scenario for someone in a 40% tax bracket, it equates to, if you work through the math, basically a 67% increase in the amount of benefit. The refund increases the total contribution by about 2/3. So those are the numbers that I think are relevant. And if you wanted to compare, how much you improve by grossing up relative to reinvesting the refund, you're looking at least a 2/3 improvement as well. So huge benefits by grossing up our initial dollars to the fully cooked pasta in the RSP.
All right. Now, this sounds, it could be like a massive improvement for retirement savings, of course. That said, some investors might struggle with the execution. So, what are some of the common mistakes that investors might make with the RRSP gross up?
A lot of people aren't comfortable borrowing to invest, but you've got to realize that the gross up loan, as I call it, is really only over a couple of weeks, and in some cases you'll pay negligible interest, if any. So I wouldn't even categorize that as borrowing to invest. It's really just a let's use borrowed money for a couple of weeks to get the full before tax amount in the RSP. So I wouldn't call that an issue. What we have to be careful of, however, is if you don't reinvest that refund, you start off intending to gross up, but that refund comes back and you already have taken a trip to the Caribbean in the wintertime because the winter is cold here in Canada, right? And you don't have the money and that refund comes back, well, there's obviously that common temptation. Okay, well, I'll just use the refund to pay off the credit card that I used to go down south. So we've got that behavioral risk of make sure you follow through on the plan. If you're going to intend to gross up, you need to do that, or like others, you will actually be better off perhaps not using RSPs.
Okay. And one thing I wanted to mention as well that a lot of us might find ourselves in is for those who do work that usually employers offer RSP contributions through the work, and then you might be part of a pension where you can also contribute as well. So does that impact our room or the gross up calculation at all?
Well, again, your good point, because you have to be careful. We're assuming that an RSP contribution results in a tax refund. But if you're using a group RSP plan or you've adjusted your withholding taxes properly, you won't get a refund at all. Generally, we're talking here about voluntary savings above that. Okay. So if the employer is properly taxing you at, say, your $50,000 a year level, and then you contribute another $5,000 to an RSP, well, that is going to result in a tax refund. But otherwise, it will not.
Okay, yeah. Thanks for clarifying that. Now, some investors may not have excess cash on hand or be comfortable borrowing money. So, is there any other way they can gross up their RRSP contributions?
They can, and the ideal way to do that is to adjust the withholding taxes from your employer while you simultaneously increase your monthly savings on a pay yourself first plan type of a basis. But you have to do both, right? So you can say, let's say, again, to keep the math simple, let's say you're investing $100 a month and you're again in a 50% tax bracket. You would change that $100 a month contribution to the equivalent in an RSP, $200 a month, right? We gross it up to the fully cooked pasta, if you will. And then you can adjust the withholding taxes. You have to file a T1213 and account for the increased or grossed up larger RSP contributions on a monthly basis. That way, there won't be any loan necessary. You won't get
Okay.
any tax refund, but obviously you're doubling in this case the amount going into the RSP. And the unfortunate reality there, again, here is behaviorally, you're going to have to do that every year. Unfortunately, you can't do it and have it continue indefinitely.
Understood. Now, the last way to help boost RRSP contributions is to consider using what's called a top-up loan. I know you've mentioned this a couple of times so far. So can you take us through that and how does it work?
Well, let's consider a situation where maybe you inherit some money and you've got a bonus at work perhaps, and you want to catch up on some of that unused RSP contribution room that's been carrying forward for decades perhaps now, right? And let's say you wanted to put $5,000 into your RSP and you only have $1,000 in your pocket. Okay. So what we could do in that 50% tax bracket scenario is we could temporarily go out and borrow the $4,000 difference, a top-up loan, if you will, right? We're going to put the total in, 4,000 borrowed plus 1,000 we started with. 5,000 goes into the RSP. We, late RSP season, will get a refund of half of the 5,000 total, right? Half of 5,000 is 2,500. The $2,500 is not, in this case, enough to completely and immediately repay the loan that we borrowed, right? We borrowed 4,000, we're going to pay off the 2,500. So now we've got a balance left of 1,500, right? That we need to pay off. Now, if you pay that off within a year, say, that is generally considered a top-up strategy where you're going to increase the amount you put in this year, but you're going to pay off the remaining balance over the next 10, 12 months perhaps. Part of the reason you don't want to do that longer than a year is next year you're going to face the same scenario. And you don't want to keep ratcheting that up over time. So generally top-up loans are those that are small enough that after applying the refund to the loan, you can pay the balance off within 12 months.
Okay. Now, do you think that's a strategy that we should be considering to just maximize the amounts of contribution that we have available to us each year to use these top-up loans?
Well, top-up loans are, I think, generally in the industry accepted as a valid strategy, but they're not the best approach. The best approach is to truly get onto a automatic savings approach, what's typically called pay yourself first, set up a monthly savings plan that ideally gets grossed up if you're using an RSP to the full equivalent before tax amount, and then as needed, adjust the withholding taxes using a 1213 tax form. And that way you don't have any debt. You don't have to worry about borrowing and the risks associated with doing that. So that really is the best approach. But unfortunately, a lot of people aren't considering that. Then they find themselves staring at their tax return saying, I don't want to pay this much tax. What can I do? And obviously, the RSP is one of the ways that can help.
Yeah. And we just want to preface this to everyone in our audience. Please understand and consider that the potential risks whenever you do borrow money, there are interest rate risks and credit risks associated with it. So it is probably advisable to confer or consult with a tax specialist or financial planner before you use the top-up loan strategy there. And just a quick reminder to our audience, if you want to hear about some other tax strategies to consider, check out our past webinar, 5 Ways to Help Lower Taxes Before Year End. It's available in the Learning Center on Webroker and on TD's YouTube page. All right, Talbot, we're going to leave it there for our conversation for today. So thanks so much for sharing some ways for Canadians to help squeeze out more value from their RSPs. Hopefully those in our audience are already eager to crunch the numbers and boost their own savings. Now, before we wrap things up, let's reveal the answer to our trivia question. As a refresher, the question was, how large was the median RRSP contribution in fiscal 2021, the latest year for which data is available? And the answer is the median RRSP contribution rose to a record high of $3,890 in fiscal 2021, according to data from Statistics Canada there. Any surprises there, Talbot, in your years of researching this?
No, not really. The bottom line is, however, those numbers, particularly when we talk about the median, which is the typical amount contributed to RSPs, while they have increased, they're still relatively low in terms of what Canadians need to be saving. Now, part of the reason for that could be that people have a pension plan at work or contributing to a group RRSP that addresses part of that need. But clearly, from a voluntary savings perspective, we can't save $3,000 a year for 15, 20 years and expect that to perhaps get us all the way to our retirement goals.
Retirement. Absolutely. And before we part, any final thoughts you'd like to share with our viewers?
No, I think we've done a good job of starting the conversation and helping Canadians realize that for the majority of middle income Canadians, RSPs are a very effective, I would even say the best strategy for saving for retirement. But that is only true if they are aware of this after tax versus before tax difference, and they're using a more effective strategy for their refund than spending it.
Yeah, I'm definitely going to remember dry pasta and fully cooked pasta as a way of triggering that for me. So once again, thanks again, Talbot, for joining us. And for those in our audience, make sure to register for upcoming live webinars and check out our library of on-demand content available in the Learning Center and on our YouTube page. See you all next time.